Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to give a warm welcome to all the parents, siblings, and family members joining us for Family Weekend. It's been great seeing so many smiling faces with us on College Hill tonight. I'm Mina Sarmas. I'm a senior studying biology and public health, and I'm the president of the Undergraduate Council of Students. The Undergraduate Council of Students, or UCS, serves as the policy and advocacy branch of student government here at Brown. We are the bridge between students and administration, where we voice student concerns to administration, and we also ensure that important information and resources are communicated back to students. As student leaders, we have the privilege to work closely with various administrators across campus. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing President Paxson, someone who has been essential in our work on campus. President Paxson has served as Brown University's 19th president and professor of economics and public policy since July 1st, 2012. Under her leadership, Brown has elevated teaching and research, developed the physical campus to support a world-class education, strengthened community engagement, and supported the students, faculty, and staff who live and work at Brown. Please join me in welcoming President Paxson.
And thank you, Mina. UCS does a really terrific job. Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to Family Weekend. It's great to see all of you here. In just a few moments, I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker. And before that, I just want to say a very few brief words. First, I want to encourage everybody, if they haven't thought about this already, to take in some of the amazing programs and events that we have planned for the families. Tomorrow we'll have classic Ivy League football, pitting Bears against Tigers. That would be Brown versus Princeton. Brown is going to win. And yes, they will. And I hope that many of you will check out Waterfire tomorrow night. It's a celebration of arts and culture downtown in beautiful downtown Providence. It was started by a Brown alum, so that's another point of pride for us. The most important thing, though, for all of the parents and family members who are here this weekend is to see firsthand how life is for your child here at Brown. And you know, I know from experience that college students, and this is more for the first-year parents of first-year students, they differ in how they communicate with their families. So some of you may be getting downloads real-time every day. That was not my experience. Others may be settling for brief, very sporadic texts. I fell into that category. And others of you may be relying on following, some people would say stalking, your children on Instagram for confirmation that they are well immersed in college life. So usually the families of first-year students are the most well represented here on Family Weekend, but you know, regardless of where your students are at Brown, I just wanted to stress three things that I hope you're seeing when you're here on campus. First, and maybe the most important, is that your students, your children feel grounded and comfortable here. They're making lifelong friends. They're finding their place within this community. That's really important to their education. That's what we want to see. Second, I hope you see that they are enrolled in courses that are interesting and challenging and intellectually engaging. There are lingering myths out there about Brown. For example, that the open curriculum gets students off the hook from taking hard classes. I hope that you are learning from them something quite different. Brown students are very serious about their academic work. The open curriculum lends itself to academic rigor. And you know, our view is that when students take the courses that they want to take instead of the courses that they are forced to take, they're more engaged in their learning, and this impacts the teaching as well. People love to teach engaged students. Third, I would hope that you see your children developing a good cadence of academics and extracurriculars and social life that works for them. My experience, really more as an administrator and teacher, is that this can be difficult and challenging for students, especially in the first year, and especially for students like Brown students who want to leap into everything. I mean, I have met with students who were saying, you know, I really want to take 6 classes. And it's like, no, that's probably not a good idea. and you probably can't be part of 6 clubs while you're doing that. This is an area where I think families can be a little bit helpful, giving that nudge to kind of think about balance, think about health, well-being, and how people are spending their time while they're here. Finally, before I get to my introduction, I have to recognize that your students are on campus during a difficult time nationally and globally. We're talking about terrorism and war and conflict and racism and anti-Semitism and censorship and political polarization and so much more. These things can and do create tensions, fears, sometimes even conflict on campus among members of our community. And I'm an optimist, though. I think that this is really why students come to a college campus. It's to live and learn from difference, learn through discussion. And so sometimes these times create opportunities for learning and growth, and I hope that's what we see here this semester. So I really stand proud of what we do at Brown, everything that we do every single day. The story is the same. It's students and faculty working together as partners, advancing knowledge in a spirit of free inquiry in a diverse and inclusive community. That's what we strive for. So now it's my honor, a true honor, to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Chivers as he speaks to us about fostering freedom of expression in polarized times. Amazing story of his life and career, and maybe he'll tell us more about it, but he's worked for 2 decades at the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, primarily covering conflict, crime, the arms trade, human rights on overseas assignments, and more recently doing more work here in the US. He's shared 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and in 2017 he won a 3rd for his investigation of a case of a young veteran from the war in Afghanistan who was suffering from PTSD, who was incarcerated in Illinois for a crime he could not recall. And as a result of his reporting, this veteran was released from prison. He is himself, Chris is a Marine Corps infantry veteran of the Persian Gulf War. He also had peacekeeping duties during the LA riots in 1992 before transitioning to journalism. And for a time, he was a reporter right here locally at the Providence Journal. He now teaches a class on war reporting and critical thinking at Columbia University. And I was going to say to him, you know, Brown is closer. Just saying. He is a resident of Rhode Island, so it really is closer. He is also a commercial fisherman, an oyster farmer, a beekeeper, a micro-farming homesteader exploring with his family the roles and values of a low-carbon, sustainable local food system in a rapidly changing world. His son, Mick Chivers, is a member of the class of 2024. So please join me in welcoming Chris, please.
Thank you, President Sarmas and President Paxson. Thank you as well to all the family members who came to campus for what you can expect, I think, will be a memorable weekend. I returned last weekend from similar festivities at another university, which my daughter attends now as a sophomore. And while I was there, she updated me on her experience, her dreams, her academic plans, and ultimately showed me how a sparkling young woman who she has become was thoughtfully organizing for herself her 4 years to optimize what her university offers. I learned this in ways that you might learn a lot this weekend yourselves by shadowing her on campus, listening to her and asking a few questions. Before I left, I realized something really special. Her narrations of university life really verged on thrilling. I'll be seeking the same thing myself this weekend here on campus as I learn more about the path Brown offers to Mick, my son who's a senior, but plans to stick around through 2028 for medical school. And I wish all of you this same sort of satisfying communion with your children or your siblings or your grandchildren here. So my talk this evening is about fostering freedom of expression, and of course it'll be somewhat about roles Brown can play in nurturing that in this very perilous, utterly polarized era. But it's also about roles that you can play, that I can play, that we play as citizens, as readers, as speakers, as observers and inhabitants of the world. Before I do that, and it's going to get dark, because we've got to survey some very difficult material, frontally, without hesitation and without equivocation. But before we go there, I'd like to say a few more reassuring thoughts for the class of 2027 this time. This will be the upbeat period of the evening, warm words before things get bleak. Your children have been on campus here only a few weeks. They're getting their bearings socially and academically, and you guys are adjusting to quieter nests, lonely nests, unless you're a younger sibling and you got a better bedroom. You're proud, but you got questions about how they're doing and what will await them. And none of us can answer that for you. We don't know. But from experience, and I'll tell you a little about that experience in a moment, I'll say this, and no one put me up to it. I think your students are in very good hands here. I say this from experience. My family's association with this university goes back decades. My wife was an undergrad here in the 80s, and she later returned for master's work that ably prepared her for a career change. My son is in his 4th year, and he was admitted at the start of the pandemic. You can imagine the state of uncertainty and confusion in beginning college then. And yet still, across all this time and these varied circumstances, our collective experience with Brown has been affirming and positive. It began with engagements with faculty and peers, and in the 80s when my wife had a complicated medical problem and a dean, no less, took an interest to help her navigate that successfully. You can flash forward to 2023, and my son's, I think, having an exhilarating experience as a pre-med majoring, believe it or not, and this is going to sound very Brown, in art. He studied Middle Eastern history and politics, written poetry, explored neurology, and cross-enrolled in a class at the Rhode Island School of Design, all while working through those pre-med requirements. He's in a lab some days, and almost every night he's in a studio. Where else can this happen except a university of this caliber? But what Brown offers goes past academic and cultural enrichment, from visits to health services for various ailments and injuries. The kid is a rather maniacal and addicted surfer, so he gets hurt. To various dealings with the financial aid office that actually promptly returns my phone calls and messages while engaging in thoughtful conversations about need. We've seen Brown serve students comprehensively. It's really not just their school, it's their surrogate home. And I submit to you, if you're a new parent or a new family member and have a student here in the class of 2027, that the university can offer your student substantive safeguards and support in addition to that world-class education that you knew you were going to get the moment your student was accepted. And I'll offer that I know this firsthand. That's the end of the cheerleading. So now let's kind of lift a pretty dark professional palette, which goes with documenting and conveying to others something of the state of our world. I'm principally addressing students, members of a generation to whom all unsolved problems in time will be bequeathed. But I welcome questions from any of you when I'm done. I will say, I arrived here by roundabout means, this stage. Early in my freshman year at a different college than this, 40 years ago, exactly this month, 2 truck bombs in the Middle East changed the direction of my life. Together, those bombs killed more than 300 people, most of them U.S. Marines and sailors, but also more than 50 French paratroopers together contingents on peacekeeping duties to the Lebanese Civil War. I remember flipping through Newsweek and pausing at images showing grief, anger, exhaustion. You know the palette because you've seen similar images this week on young faces basically the same age as mine. Just like citizens who volunteered after the suicide attacks in New York and Washington in 2001, I joined the Marines. I entered an officer program, and while finishing a liberal arts degree, I made time to study, in class and on my own, histories of organized violence, war literature, war-related art, the principles and laws that influence and theoretically restrict combatants' behavior in war, while conditioning myself for rigors ahead. I served about 6 years as an infantry officer, including in the Persian Gulf War, and then on so-called peacekeeping duties after the riots in Los Angeles in 1992, following the acquittal of police officers who beat Rodney King almost to death. An unexpected thing happened on my way back from martial law and war. I developed an allergy to authority and a suspicion of official narratives, and a desire never to be in government service again. These informed my motivation for attending journalism school after my discharge, but it's actually more complicated than that. I was also motivated by personal experience with the free expression of others. That's kind of obtuse. What the hell do I mean? In the Marines, I lived in a very particular culture, largely closed to outsiders, and I held jobs central to the Corps' identity, and I thought I knew my culture well. And yet, time and again, I read news accounts that informed me of things occurring inside my own organization of which I had been entirely unaware. Newsweek, as I told you, influenced my decision to join, and the New York Times informed my decision to leave. In 1993, I read an article in the Times in which Eric Schmidt, a reporter, now a friend, wrote of closeted queer Marines entering heterosexual marriages with queer Marines of the opposite gender, thereby masking themselves from suspicion and retaliation in a time when their sexual orientation was the ground for removal from the ranks and a discharge laden with shame, and not just shame, future employment repercussions too. Eric's story began, open quote, "When anyone asks, the 23-year-old Marine Corps corporal says she met her husband at college, they fell in love, and were married by a justice of peace in North Carolina with a dozen office colleagues as witnesses. What she never says is that the story, as well as the marriage itself, is all a sham. Quote, it's a game to stay alive, close quote, said the corporal who has been in the Marines for 3 years, hiding the fact that both she and her civilian husband are gay. It's a game that hundreds, perhaps thousands of service members across the country play to protect their privacy and to avoid being drummed out of a military they love. It's a game involving great risk that requires them to fabricate minute details about an entire life that does not really exist." Close quote. I suspect some of you want me to continue, right? You want to know the rest of the story. I understand, I did. I couldn't put that story down, sitting there in my Marine uniform. There I was, not long after relinquishing company command, a made member, if you will, encountering something extraordinarily revelatory about the organization I was in, but that I had not known before. So let's talk process. How did this revelation occur? How did I receive it? How was it delivered in such a public way? The process illuminates the value of free expression. I had been enlightened because Eric slipped first through the seams of a relatively closed Marine Corps culture and then through the seams of a much more closed queer Marine subculture to examine circumstances hidden from view. He did this by talking to vulnerable people and channeling informed voices on a platform that shared facts and human experience directly related to contentious public policy questions. Remember that quote? "It's all a game to stay alive," said the corporal. That's a voice. And voices like these were ahead of the world, at least ahead of federal policy, sharing suppressed points of view soon to go mainstream as a discriminatory and punitive barrier to service fell. But I observed something else back then. Thoughtful expression begets thoughtful expression. When I raised the contents of that article with peers, conversations followed. Free expression was performing its public function. Some conversations turned ugly. There's bigots in the Marine Corps, just like anywhere else. Others were productive. A few were uplifting. People in my professional and social orbits wrestled with biases, assumptions, facts, questions. Expression led to more expression, which led to me understanding my world more fully than I had been able to understand it myself, because a few hidden sources and a thoughtful reporter committed a little journalism under my nose. Journalism, I wanted in on this game. By the mid-1990s, I was in Providence, working for the city's newspaper, The Journal, where among my assignments was a beat covering the city's wildly flamboyant and criminally corrupt mayor, Buddy Cianci. Some of you remember Buddy, right? Yeah, I hear the chuckles. For those of you who don't, you're forgiven. But think of the Penguin of Batman fame. Now think of the Penguin with a jack-booted police escort, rocking in a red leather chair in the corner office of City Hall with a tumbler of scotch in his hand, mid-afternoon, and obsequious underlings scooting in and out of the room to tell him just how wonderful he was and to tell me to be nice. It was gross. It was also fascinating. I thought I was done with war until in 1999, the New York Times hired me with instructions to be ready to cover whatever armed conflicts came next. Students, something similar may happen to you one day. What it was my background shaped my future. But the United States was between wars, a weird sentence, I know. So my first assignment was with the New York Police Department, where in 2001, the next war found me downtown on the morning of September 11th, when aircraft struck the World Trade Center. I was running toward the second tower and almost inside when the second plane hit. My life changed again. For large chunks of the next 15 years, I worked as a correspondent in the field. The Times kept its promise and sent me where they said they had originally intended, covering organized violence, state crackdowns, insurgency, terrorism, and the aftermath of war. Months after months would pass with me overseas, away from my family, in proximity to all manner and forms of political violence, each with its own background and facts, including the temporary collapse of the Taliban, the Second Intifada, and the siege of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and the abduction by a Chechen terrorist group of students, faculty, and parents at a public school in Beslan, Russia in 2004. More than 330 people died before that ended, a large fraction of them young children. I'll never forget it. I spent about 2 years examining in detail what happens when combatants suspend their humanity, ignore all those conventions and codes that I had studied, and seize children as hostages to try bending a state to its will. Later in other wars, I saw the dispiriting toll of civilian casualties, a far higher toll, and heard and watched the falsehoods, evasions, and lies that those responsible and their enablers circulated around all that death. I also saw countless people failed by those they served after their own war service was done, to fend for themselves as they tried taking a place in a world not much interested and often uninformed about their experience and what shape it left them in. and I'm not just talking about in the United States. Not helping people in need is a universal failure. In any event, then I stopped, abruptly, done. Why? Why would you walk away from such an important seat? My children couldn't take it. They had been exposed to calls when friends were killed, a call when a coworker and a friend was maimed by a landmine, a call when another was standing over the body of a peer who was alone and with no car along a border they had to cross. More calls when friends were abducted, and then another round when some were murdered by terrorists on videos and propaganda snuff films. I expect that some of you have taken painfully difficult calls from Israeli and Palestinian relatives or friends, and not just this week. I offer you my compassion and sorrow. I won't pretend to know exactly how you feel, even having been there myself. Each time it happens to me again, I'm shocked by the intensity and contours of that pain and its resulting confusions, which are, let's be clear, utterly warping. And who can we protect? When I did something as leaving for my work, some of my children suffered bouts of fear. The weight of dread erodes physical and mental health. On my last trip to Iraq, one of my children broke out in a full body rash. After talking with their pediatrician upon my return, I told my brother, a former Marine himself, that I felt lost. I knew my work was harming my kids, but I wondered, is there a way to continue while somehow safeguarding them? Because the world felt a fire. We were being fed bullshit incessantly by government or one government or combatant or another, and people needed access to reality, the same kind of reality that Eric Schmidt had offered me in 1993. I sought clarity. My brother had it. He said, if your child is sick and you know the medicine that will heal them, do you withhold it? I decided I was home for good, for them. I've yet to be back. Don't be fooled by this drama you just heard. I was lucky. I got out on my terms, with all my limbs, before my children suffered lasting damage. Countless others proximal to war cannot say anything like that. Innumerable people are trapped in violence, unable to relocate in any humane or organized fashion, unable to find other prospects or work, and at the mercy of combatants all around them, like the residents of Gaza right now. I got to come home and start over and to try resetting my cognitive wiring. So here I am, home, knowing I made the right ethical choice for my children, but feeling still benched by that choice, severed from what I knew and from a conversation that needs to include more voices, voices that Eric had showed me how to find and that I used to find myself. And yet my return offered something I hadn't anticipated. As I tried unclenching my entire self from what had become a perennially intense state of vigilance, a life connected to a pump flushing me with a weird and addicting cocktail of fear, purpose, anger, and sorrow, all behind a straight face, my mind slowed. Life gave me time to observe more of the world away from my focus on the workings of violence, to behold with a longer stare the vista of daunting, intractable problems on horizons near and far. In the face of those problems, populations yearn for solutions, safety, equality, justice, but many of them also live in polarized political climates in which their institutions and leaders have proven unable or unwilling to tackle effectively what's before them. This describes the United States tonight. The problems vary in scale and in complexity, but some are existential. Articulating a list would consume more time than we have together, so let's confine it to a few. We face palpable threats to and rollbacks of rule of law, free and fair elections, human rights. Throw in climate change and the persistence of nuclear weapons in the custody of governments with weakened institutions, and potentially with leaders explicitly bristling with aggression or hate, and we face threats to the future of entire ecosystems and even human populations if we get this wrong. Americans cling to notions of national greatness. I applaud those loyal to their homes. As an American who loves my own home, I must also account for grotesque income inequality, overcrowded prisons that disproportionately house low-income and minority inmates, recurring patterns of police brutality, persistent obstacles for a large fraction of our population to safe and affordable housing and health care, frequent mass shootings, a raging opioids epidemic that has seen fatal overdoses roughly quadruple in a dozen years, and movements to unravel safeguards to rights, choices, and privacy. A census of our legislative and executive suites can look like a portrait of gerontocracy. Our Supreme Court resists ethical standards even as repeated exposés show that more than one jurist enjoys financial and leisure perks from wealthy benefactors. Further, the data suggests declining public schools. That doesn't bode well for the future with a list like that. And a little more, as an aside, than a few stone throws from here, on a street named none other than Hope, is a public high school that is part of a school system that has performed so poorly that it has been taken over by the state. The contrast between this setting and that setting, separated by mere paces, smacks of Charles Dickens. Worryingly, in part because of the dark arts of propaganda and misinformation, we don't even have public consensus on whether some of these problems exist. We have no time to speak in detail of all of these issues, so I'll speak on themes of which I concentrated decades of my time, our instruments of national security and war. The institutions with the largest share of our treasure and a large share of our capital, human capital, have badly checkered records. To wit, the same military, services, and intelligence and surveillance agencies that failed to protect us from terrorist attacks on 9/11 then engaged in an international campaign, the global war on terror, that happened to coincide in cases it created more of the very crimes and criminals that the national war footing expressly set out to stop. Don't believe me? Oxford University's assembled data showing how the frequency of attack and quantity of victims of acts of terror spiked sharply higher in the years of these campaigns. You can look it up. You might also spend time with the chilling data and analysis at Brown's own Cost of War project. Consider that homework, right? You're in school. As you read, hold your thoughts. One glaring example. The terrorist organization ISIS did not exist before the United States under false pretenses led the invasion and occupation of Iraq. It formed and metastasized under American occupation, from which it spread onto the international stage to draw ever more public resources into counter-terror actions against it as more people died. The invasion was a miscalculation with a human toll beyond accounting, rooted in arrogance, dishonesty, and power, but not just any power. Remember, we're talking about free expression. It was rooted in the power that comes when war hysteria, misinformation, and anger, justifiable anger, drown out dissent and undermine essential checks and balances. Moreover, ISIS caused far more suffering and harm to Muslim victims than its Western victims. I raise this not to assign victims a weighted rank. Human life is human life, no matter a person's nationality, gender, faith, race. I offer it to share that the toll of ISIS was far larger than some of you have heard. And now the world confronts another outbreak of loss and suffering, another example of how intractable problems, when they persist, extend their agonies. The latest escalation began with Hamas targeting civilians, resulting in more than 1,000 deaths and more than 1,000 abductions, tallies absorbed primarily by Israeli civilians. Israel's military response continues, including waves of strikes with high explosive ordnance in Gaza, where more than 2 million Palestinians live year upon year in dire humanitarian circumstances, behind fences and walls with little prospect for work or for hope, under recurring threat of being killed or dispossessed of housing by military action, amid losses of civilian life many times larger than that of their neighbors. Cut from electricity and fuel and food supplies, roughly 1 million of them, about the same size as the population of the state of Rhode Island, have been ordered to relocate with little time, and few, if any, places safe to go. For a sense of logistical scale, imagine the entire population of Rhode Island under threat of death and instant demolition of home, trying to evacuate itself in 24 hours, even with open borders, abundant food, and fuel. All the while, Israel is confronted with the possibility of a large attack by Hezbollah from the north. Please take a moment and reflect upon the myriad forms of suffering and pain the people directly affected by this conflict and its many crimes are enduring, and that of their extended circles, which no doubt includes people in this room. As you pause, consider boundless condolence and compassion for those harmed, no matter who they are, and for their devastated families, and to those who will be harmed soon. I offer mine. Thank you. A primary role of the practice of journalism on news pages is to do description, not prescription. Again, description, not prescription. Public description itself is difficult. It is often very hard to determine with certainty what happened yesterday or last week, much less what happened minutes ago, which some digitally connected consumers now expect. Even if you know what happened, it can be equally difficult to convey facts and potential meanings quickly with clarity and fairness. Trained, professionally edited writers struggle at this task every day. But prescription? That's a different role altogether. It's one thing to describe a complex problem. It's another to purport to know how to solve it. That requires expertise and inputs from many, many quarters. I know as a journalist that I cannot solve much of what I see. And before you ask, I will assure you that I alone can't solve any of what I just described, even if I thought I knew how, which I don't. And yet, of course, I also know, as you do, that these problems demand solutions. So let's allow a question to float above us. What can a university and its students do to help create conditions in which problems of consequence might be solved? This brings us to the role, the necessity of free expression. I teach a course in war journalism at Columbia. One of my students' annual exercises is to examine statements from government and private sources central to public discourse before the invasion of Iraq. I ask students to do the following: locate and assess the American government and its supporters' expressed reasons for the war, as articulated before it began, and evaluate them in light of what became known later. I suggest a few resources and processes, including that they place the results of a CIA-sponsored, publicly released review of the actual state of the Iraq government's chemical weapons program at the time of invasion, written after the invasion. Put that next to what proponents of invasion asserted before. Though their work requires a lot of reading and coherent analysis, it must not be an especially hard exercise, given that what they report back every year is the same. Official statements by the United States government and from prominent allies and proponents of that war were thick with falsehood and naive, optimistic assumptions. We know the results. We don't need to go over them. Already did. Set aside, though, for a moment, moral questions about right versus wrong. Hover for this exercise in the practical world. The factual and analytical weakness in the case for war informed conceptually nonsensical plans. Who ever thought that 100,000 or so troops on the ground at a time, after chasing rulers from capitals, could durably and favorably reorder the governing fiber of two countries of now roughly 40 million residents each, at times simultaneously, halfway around the world, in regions where few of those assigned to occupation, nation building, or counterinsurgency tasks, call them what you will, had more than a passing association with the languages, cultures, histories, politics, or primary religions in the lands they occupied. Who thought that was possible? I mean, imagine if we sent 100,000 troops tomorrow to Texas, population of maybe 30 million, removed the established parties by force, told Texans a new sheriff was in town, here are the new rules, and invited them to sign up. How do you think that would go? Right? I mean, it's obvious and sad that large numbers of people considered that the American military forces, the United States, what they tried to do, that people considered that even remotely possible, was a failure of our political culture. The country was beholden to a narrow set of voices. Dissidents had the smallest of seats. Healthy cultures foster free expression, not by welcoming, echoing, or acting solely on the prevailing or powerful voices, because a bubble of one side's free expression can be a dangerously underinformed place. Healthy cultures have a chance at more formed and effective public policy when they foster free expression and deliberations, including voices outside of the mainstream, away from those with the most power. In that same class at Columbia, each year I welcome Sinan Antoun, an Iraqi-American novelist, poet, translator, and professor at NYU. Before the invasion, Antoun was one of about 500 members of the Iraqi diaspora who signed a public petition opposing calls for invasion. He later wrote, quote, "While condemning Saddam's reign of terror, we were against a war that would cause more death and suffering for innocent Iraqis and one that threatened to push the entire region into violent chaos. Our voices were not welcomed." Close quote. No need to repeat what happened. Again, you already know. When Antoun meets my students, he does not gloat. I've detected, no, I told you so. What I detect in his sustained mourning is a different message. You like free expression? You do? Guess what comes with it? Listening. Listening. Anyone can talk, look at me now. Without listening, especially to those we might not care to hear, to those whose experience, politics, and ambitions differ from ours, we risk ignorance. And ignorance in the face of catastrophe won't spare most people from it. As a journalist and instructor, each week I ask myself what voices aren't being heard. Worse, what voices are being silenced. I look back at coverage and public discourse before the 2003 invasion, and I feel the absence of anti-war and humanitarian voices, along with the absence of the voices of those who would be most profoundly affected by what was about to occur. That contemporaneous absence, whether because they were curated out of the conversation by journalists and government officials, or afraid to speak up after sensing hostility or futility in participation, haunts my understanding of a tragedy beyond measure, and with consequences that continue to this hour. Listening. It requires tolerance, patience, and respect. This brings us to Brown and any institution like it. Among their many roles, universities foster critical thinking, knowledge development, independent research, access to archives and laboratories, and communication skills. They can also be sanctuaries of tolerance, patience, and respect, although this too feels under threat. And not just this week, but of course this week too. And yet, at their best, universities are places where, with capable instructors paired to cultures that protect difficult discourse, students engage with ideas that challenge their assumptions and beliefs in forums and formats that encourage, what's that word? Listening. To be averse to listening is to be averse to learning, to resist knowing what's actually going on. What if, for example, I did not listen to my children's fear and pain while I was separated from them for much of their lives, out documenting war? My own answer to that is that I would have been loathsome, given that on my last trip, one of my children grew sick, which the doctor said was an autoimmune miscue system activated by dread, presumably the fear for a parent's life. After I came home, that rash cleared up within days. I'm glad I listened, then incorporated what I heard into my behavior, the even more difficult second step. Listening is more than skill. It's an imperative, so listen up. Given our location, I think we can agree that certain rights and conditions are fundamental. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion rank high among them. So do access to clean water, healthy food, safe shelter, and basic utilities. I comfortably assert that everyone in this room wants to live by a sturdy rule of law. From fair-minded criminal and zoning codes up to the body of international humanitarian law and conventions that seek to guide state behaviors in the use of force. These rights and conditions are not just for when times are easy and life is good. You don't only stop at a red light when you're happy. They apply as well to times of turmoil, crisis, and threat. The moments when we learn whether rights and equality apply to everyone, or if they are to be denied the less powerful whenever the more powerful wish. The title of this talk was Fostering Freedom of Expression in Polarized Times. Brown can do that, and most of us expect it to keep doing that. In the main, it does, including right here and right now. Though as someone who has lived at the nexus of violent conflict and its effects for decades, I would not want President Sarmas's or President Paxson's jobs and have to face the tension of navigating and upholding free speech every day. Maybe they don't want mine. But let's swing the spotlight away from leaders and from me, your speaker, and onto each other. To remember that free expression is not just the role of institutions, whether they be colleges or newspapers or governments. It lies with each and every one of us and all of you as individuals to try to summon the strength and the tolerance to hear. Now, I told you I was going to go dark. I think that was pretty bleak. Let's come back. I want to fall back into our space and our reason for gathering today. We're here as families for our students, and I hope sincerely that no matter the state of the world beyond the campus, that your shared time is meaningful and fulfilling, even joyous. You guys know that feeling, right? You've had it. Smiling through tears, laughing while sobbing. It's okay, it's part of the way out. We need our families ever more in times of fear and pain. I hope that grounding rituals, along with hope in the promise and future of this generation we came here to celebrate, sustain you all. Thank you. I expect we're about to listen to many questions. I'll do my best to answer them.
Are these on? Now they are. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a talk that was very thought-provoking. We do have time for questions. I'm going to take maybe 10, 15 minutes. We have microphones on both sides, so think about questions and you can come down. I have a couple questions I wanted to ask you just to get us going. And one is very self-serving. I need your thoughts on something that has been on my mind and the minds of many of my colleagues all week. So a lot of people have very strongly held views about when and even whether universities should make public statements on current issues, political and social issues. And one view that I would associate most closely with the University of Chicago is that universities should remain strictly neutral, even silent, because by taking a position, they may suppress freedom of expression among their students and their faculty. And of course, others say that universities should be moral voices and they should be out there talking all the time. Have you thought about that?
I can fall back on my speech and say, thank you for that description, and now you're asking for prescription.
Well, yes, I am.
So look, I'm not qualified to answer that. I wish I were, but I haven't spent a lot of time thinking in that space, because I think in the space where I communicate in particularly sort of narrow formats that are really familiar to me, I do listen to and sometimes journalistically harvest statements from all sorts of organizations, institutions, and people. I'll confess to a certain bias. It's just me, and I don't mean to disappoint you, but I'll speak personally. I don't especially care what a university thinks about this or that.
Thank you.
Right? Every time some of us speak, we're taking the voice from someone else closer to the problem or with more influence over the problem. That's just my personal bias. So if I'm like writing away, unless I'm assigned to do a story, and I read some stories this week about what universities should do, I'm not especially paying attention to that because I'm looking closer to the source of the event.
Yeah.
It might not be a satisfying answer, but that's kind of where I come down. There's so much, I talk about listening, there's so much out there to listen to. You only have so much ear, right? And so I don't put a lot of ear there on that. There's a lot of things I'd like to hear a university about, but there's some things I don't care what you think about the price of Taylor Swift tickets. And I don't care about necessarily what a given university thinks about a public policy question to which it's not directly related. Generally, that's me. I'm declaring that with my bias. It's not necessarily helpful to you, but...
No. Actually, it's very interesting. One thing you said that, a theme in your talk, and tell me if I got you wrong, is, freedom of expression is really important because you listen to more voices, you don't just listen to powerful voices. But in some sense, we're in this, contrast that with a lot more voices, a lot of which are spewing out misinformation and things that aren't true. And how are people supposed to sort through that? That's sort of like...
It's a good question, because when you think about it, like, everyone in this room is now, I think, I'll take a risk, maybe there's a few outlying exceptions, you're connected to mass communication tools in which you can participate in the discourse. And if you get it really right or if you get it really wrong, any one of you in minutes, hours, or days can be the center of a global conversation, for better or worse. There's so many voices out there. One of the things I've learned as someone who speaks is when to shut up, right? I don't think I've tweeted more than a few times in the last year, right? There's just so many people doing it. I stopped. There's so much noise out there that it's hard to find the voices that I need most to do my job and that I need most to, observe and understand the world. So, there's, as I see it, there's just times to sort of spend on the sideline and learn. Here's a funny story. Jen Jones and I, we both worked at the paper down the hill. And on my first day at that paper, I was hired with about 15 or 20 interns. They put us in a small room, maybe a large conference room. And the editor came in and started talking to us. And he said a lot of things I don't remember, but he said one thing I've always remembered. I think about it all the time. He said, there's this thing you do between reporting, and by that he means going out and gathering information, researching, think of it, between reporting and writing. And there was this long, pregnant pause, and the editor said, it's called thinking. right? It's pretty good advice. Like a lot of times, I don't know what I think exactly yet, or I have a lot of thoughts and I know not to trust them yet, but I don't have enough information and I need more time. And the rush to get every institution to make, even to exert a statement out of institutions might not put the institutions in the position where they're going to give you the information that's most useful to you. So I can just tell you in my own case, I can't really recall times where I'm looking at a public policy question and the back of my head, I wonder what the universities think. It just doesn't work that way. I do wonder maybe what experts at the university who work in that lane their whole life think, and I call them, but I don't necessarily need something from the front office.
So could we go, and please, if you want to ask, I have a lot of questions here. I could just keep going, but I really want people to come to the microphones if they have things that they want to ask, and then we can switch over to the audience. You mentioned the Projo down the hill, and I think when this was a paper that started in the 1800s. Yeah. It has a long, proud history, amazing journalists coming out of the, and it's just through no fault of the people who work there, just shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and layoffs. And I remember when I came to Providence, it was on multiple floors of whatever building it's in, and now I think it's down to like 1/2 of one corner of it. How do you think that affects the ability of people to learn the truth about what's going on?
So market forces, as you all know, and changes in communication technology really gutted local journalism and mid-sized journalism all around the country. The economics didn't work, and when the economics don't work, the businesses shrink, and they really shrank. And in that absence of a lot of mediated, arbitrated, careful conversation that journalism can ideally present, to a sort of code of conduct and understood standards. In that absence, we have things like tweets, where we have pop-up websites and other sources of fast, instant local information that maybe hasn't been through the same careful processes. Sometimes those tweets and blogs and local voices are excellent, even without training, but often they're not. And look, this is just me as I contemplate the world we're in and how we got so polarized. I think one factor in our political polarization is we've lost some of the local, small town, mid-sized town, the local discourse that we used to have across, generations. It's not gone, but it's shrunk a lot. But the world's not less noisy, it's even louder. And I think that that's one of our problems. And, I know, I need sometimes news in the state, and I have to, scratch around and to all sorts of unusual sources to find it. And then sometimes I found afterward I got played, really played. So I think it has made it more difficult for the public to have a grasp on what's going on, and it's made us more susceptible to misinformation.
Thank you. I'm going to have an awkward pause. Oh, here we go. Great, thank you.
I'm the parent of a freshman, and you'll hear from my accent, I'm from South Africa. When I was a freshman, in my first week, there was a limpet mine that blew up the station, the bottom of the hill at the University of Cape Town. By the end of my undergraduate degree, Nelson Mandela was freed. Nobody thought it would happen. And that was the pretext for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was probably the most transformative event of national reconciliation. And I'd like to ask you, do you think a Truth and Reconciliation Commission could ever happen in the Middle East? And what would be the precursor for that? Because I think the thing that made it possible in South Africa was Nelson Mandela. We don't have leaders like that.
Well, we don't need to just ask about the Middle East. They happen rarely anywhere, right? When we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, how much accounting went? Many of the archives were quickly closed up, and there wasn't really an accounting of a lot of what happened. And in war after war, we see, I've been to many, many, many different wars, and I've seen very little, if any, organized truth or reconciliation in the aftermath. What we tend to get is the victors, if to the extent they exist, and sometimes they don't really, because some of the wars lead to partitioning, so there's like no clear national winner. What we tend to get is a government, that I'm trying to think of an example where I've worked that isn't brittle, that isn't, hesitant to confront the past, and that isn't acting largely in its self-interest, shorter term. So, I just answered generally. I think what your country attempted to undertake and undertook to some degree is pretty unusual. It's pretty unusual. So, I guess my answer is not likely. But I will say this, and I'd like to qualify this with any other questions that come. You asked me a question about the future. I'm a journalist. I work in the past. Whether it was a minute ago, or a year ago, a week ago, I work in the past. I try to figure out what happened and what it means. I'm no good at the future. There's that line, what is it, things are really hard to predict, especially the future. And I get surprised by it all the time. I look back about, one of the most significant events of the last, across my working life. I didn't see any of them coming, the big ones. So I'll just caution you, if you ask me a question about the future, you're going to get kind of a very hedged, mumbling answer like that, because I don't live out there. I live now and behind us, looking back, trying to understand what we can establish as fact about things that have already occurred, so maybe we can solve some of the problems out there in the future, ideally. But I'm not really good at the future. I avoid it, with one exception. I put reasonable confidence in like 3 or 4 day out weather forecasts before I go fishing. That's about it.
In Rhode Island? In Rhode Island, really?
Sometimes it's even good out to 10 days. That's about as far as the future is like my radar swings, and as limited as my look into it. I'm sorry if I disappointed you with the answer.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So, living in this country now, moved in for more than 25 years. I have friends from the West, and I have friends from my Eastern background. And with this conflict flaring up, I see most of the people posting one flag for their profile picture and the other posting the other one. And I Googled, and I found there are pictures out there which have both flags there. But I don't see anyone picking those kind of things as they want to solve this issue, but they want to side. So it seems like we are doing 2 steps back and 1 step forward kind of thing. And the biggest step backward is the social media itself, that we are picking sides again. Is it human nature to have division and divide ourselves and not come to the table and talk, like you were talking about listening? So I was wondering if we have taken a huge step back with this social media, that nobody's picking those pictures which have both flags in it.
So can we call it by its better name? Anti-social media? So, look, I don't use social media much anymore. And why? Because it's, to me, going there is like entering a screaming coliseum where people want to stone each other to death. And because it is social media by its real name, and we're connected to people we really know and have spent time with, it feels personal, because I watch good people I know who I've been in really difficult situations with in the past saying things and going after each other in ways they would never do face to face. The weakness of social media, one of them in my view, is that it's a bad form of communication. The words I said today on the stage, they may have made some of you uncomfortable, but you probably were a little more comfortable with them because you could see me. You could hear my tone of voice. You could see my emotions. You could evaluate who you think I am. You'd get a chance to talk to me after. This is a more intimate human communication, the type of communication by which, as a species, we evolved to perform. When we get into things like phone calls and texts and social media, we strip away so many of the non-visual communication cues that are central to communication as human beings. And I think it makes it easier for it to turn into that vicious coliseum where people are screaming for each other's blood all the time. So I'm not very good about navigating social media right now because I've withdrawn from it in the main. I kept my accounts open on advice of some of my bosses that if I left them, someone will use my name and pretend to be me, which is a hassle I don't need. I have enough trouble being me, thank you. Yeah. But I think that social media, like I don't look there. You're asking me, do you look to social media for healing, for coming together? Because it so typically does the opposite. It's for tearing the fabric rather than mending the fabric in its most like visible uses for so much of the people whenever there's a contentious issue that I generally don't go to it. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading this week. I can't tell you how much time I spent reading this week. I probably spent a half hour on social media. I mean, in like little 5-minute stops. Basically just checking in those cases to make sure I'm not missing something breaking that's really big that hasn't hit the newspapers yet, because there's always like a little delay in the flash to bang. That's about it. I kind of use it now as like an alarm system, right? Like, is there a ringing alarm there I should know about? And that's about it. I don't use it otherwise at all. That's not true. I had to give directions to a funeral once this year, and it was useful for that.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions. So why don't we, maybe we should get both questions, and then you can decide which one you like better or answer both. Please, come on.
Okay, so some of us have probably your description of the war events and how it transpired. How much is that really to blame on journalism itself, in that there are people in the United States, former people inside the military, outside, inside the government, that were against a lot of things you described that occurred. They were drowned out. There were efforts to, I do agree with you, marginalize them. But the media never, and then the political parties had chances to examine why we did the war. They decided against it. They made some political deals on the side. We never really got to the actual issue of what occurred. I worry about this broad brush you have about the outcome, because there are great Americans that were totally against, fine with Afghanistan to a degree. The mission in Iraq, no, there are a lot of people against that. Some very well-minded people who've been in government for a long time. I would just like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want me to listen
Yeah,
to one more?
let's get one more question, and then we can wrap up.
Like in journalism recently, there's been a lot of trouble with like mistrust of the like mainstream media institutions when that's like boots on the ground journalism in America. At political rallies and whatnot. And I'm wondering, in your experience and in the experience of your colleagues, if that similar mistrust of like mainstream media institutions such as the New York Times has been felt in sourcing, with sources in like those conflict areas.
So I'm going to try to answer both.
Yeah.
So for your question, I've really wrestled with that a lot, and for a particular reason. I don't want to name the names, but there's a very prominent journalist who has most been blamed with writing some of the worst or most, let's say, I don't want to just say worse, for writing stories that were wrong and exaggerated the threat of Iraq. And I was with this journalist alone briefly, waiting for a meeting to start, and the journalist had a choking incident. And I gave the journalist the Heimlich maneuver. It was a bad one, and maybe saved a life. And then later, the journalist was pointed out as being, one of on the short list of the people you're describing who, misled the public through the work. So I wondered, am I, because I gave the Heimlich maneuver, like, I don't. And I wondered that for a long time. And of course, I would give the Heimlich maneuver again, and to any of you, right? Even with a time machine, if I knew what the person may do after, because I can't, having seen a lot of people die, I don't really have it in me to watch. Just don't. But I kind of still wondered, is this on me? And I was doing a book later, and I got to know a number of people who were very involved in the pre-invasion planning. And when I learned what I learned, in government, when I learned that certain military units were given the maps to where they were headed like 8 or 10 months before, that they changed their equipment, they did specified training before they went where they went, I came to feel that there really wasn't much we could have done with our typewriters to stop this, that the policy momentum almost made it set long before. I also, and I have a standard line I say to people, I do really slow long-term work now. I do very long magazine projects, investigative and explanatory pieces, and so I get a lot of people who come to me and they want help, like, would you take on my file? And every now and then I take on their file. And one of the first things I say to them, I have many things, I have like a standard preamble. One of the things I say is, I want to manage your expectation, because in my experience, the most likely thing that will happen if we spend a lot of time to do it together and I do a really thorough story and I really understand your issue and I articulate it well, the most likely thing that will happen is nothing. Nothing. When something does happen, and I tell them this, usually nobody's more surprised than me. My work informs, I hope, the public discourse, but each piece is like a chip in a huge mosaic of public discourse. You guys know what a mosaic is. You put enough chips up there and arrange them right, and they cohere into something else. That something else is public understanding, and each contribution from each journalist, no matter how arrogant, and no matter how much the journalist wants to think otherwise, is usually really small. It might be of some consequence if you're lucky, but it's usually really small. And I check myself on that all the time. Like, I got asked to give this keynote, but I'm thinking, but my work's really small, right? It is. So I don't really think that had we changed the stories you're talking about, that it might have altered the course of history, as you say. However, I will add this, and it's a big caveat. You heard it in the speech, and maybe it drew your question out. I'm also very critical of journalism and how, in many stories, in many lanes, in many beats, not just this particular question of the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, journalism does fail too often. And journalism, when it fails, often is doing exactly what you said. There were voices out there, informed people near the center who had a different view than the views we were hearing the most, and journalism didn't tap into them the way I described Eric tapping in to the queer Marine sham couples, And we bear responsibility for that. But it's a bit of a theoretical question. I don't know what would have happened if the journalism were better, but I assign an exercise and manage an exercise every single year where I come to the same point myself as a journalist who was active then, where I say, man, if there were just different voices here, would we have had a different result? So I think your question's perfectly fair, and I hope I've given you an answer with a few things to think about. Obviously, I can't give you like an ironclad answer because we can't go back in time and know what it would be like if we did it differently. We certainly, as an industry, should have done it better. Absolutely. And along many lines, including the lines I just mentioned, which is we needed more voices outside of the center, away from the power, more voices of those who would be affected, and the dissenters, we needed to hear from them. They needed to be like weighted far more heavily than they were. And I will add, I think the problem persists. Why doesn't, we have so many disciplines that we consider beats, so many strands, movements, strains of like public trends and things. We have beats. You can imagine a beat on almost anything. Why don't we have an anti-war beat? Right? Why don't we have an anti-war beat? Why don't we have a place where people talk about their opposition to something so fundamentally dangerous and world-changing? We got a climate change beat. We have war beats. But no one on the war beat that I know of, in any of these, like you use the word mainstream organizations, is assigned to the anti-war beat. Where's that? It might help us understand things a little better if we actually were actively, specifically inquiring. And your question, remind me real quick of it again. I just need a small prompt, and I'll let you guys get out of here.
It was about the trust.
Oh, are we welcome and trusted? Journalists generally have always had deficits of public trust, I think, because we do things that some people don't like. I mean, if you face hostility when you ask hard questions of powerful people. You can face hostility when you go to ravaged people in pain and try to figure out what's going on in their presence, and you're not of them, right? You're other, often, when you go to people suffering. So the hostility is familiar to me. It's of a different character now, absolutely. You think some of the pressure that journalists face sounds just like words, but wait till you've gotten a bunch of death threats. I mean, how disorienting it is, how painful, and how easy it is to issue now because everyone's hooked up to mass communications tools, and anybody can be doxxed at any time. Like, in seconds, you can get my home address, right? And in seconds, you can find numerous ways to contact me, and you can leverage that in all sorts of ways that are painful. And I know of journalists who leave the business because that's understandably too much for many people. So I don't think it's entirely new. And I will add this. I'm human, like I have limits to what I can take, but I'm prone to conflict. I like sometimes having my antlers in my subject and up over my head shaking it. I like it, right? I mean, one older journalist said to me very early in Iraq, when everyone's pointing a gun at you, you're in the right place.
Are we going to end on that note? Thank you so much for your words.